Module 9, Keynesian and Neoclassical Economics. Keynesian economics emphasizes aggregate demand. Keynes' law, demand creates its own supply. Firms produce output only if they expect it to sell. Neoclassical economics emphasizes aggregate supply. Say's law, supply creates its own demand, or emphasizes a hands-off approach because of the belief the economy will correct itself in the long run. Aggregate demand in Keynesian analysis. The Keynesian perspective focuses on aggregate demand. The idea is simple. Firms produce output only if they expect to sell it. While the availability of the factors of production determines a nation's potential GDP, the amount of goods and services actually being produced and sold, i.e. real GDP, depends on how much demand exists across the economy. Real GDP is determined only by aggregate demand, not aggregate supply. Continuing on, disposable income, income after taxes. Inflationary gap, equilibrium at a level of output above potential GDP. Interest rate, the payment for borrowed money. Recessionary gap, equilibrium at a level of output below potential GDP. What determines consumption expenditure? Consumption expenditure is spending by households and individuals on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Keynes identified 3 factors that affect consumption: disposable income, expected future income, wealth, or credit. Continuing on, spending on new capital goods is called investment expenditure. Keynes's treatment of investment focuses on the key role of expectations about the future in influencing business decisions. Expectations of future profits. Interest rates also play a significant role in determining how much investment a firm will make. Here are the determinants of aggregate demand. Reasons for a decrease in aggregate demand: consumption, rise in taxes, fall in income, rise in interest rates, desire to save more, decrease in wealth, fall in future expected income. Investment, fall in expected rate of return, rise in interest rates, drop in business confidence. The reasons for an increase in aggregate demand: consumption, decrease in taxes, increase in income, fall in interest rates, desire to save less, rise in wealth, rise in future expected income. Investment, rise in expected rate of return, drop in interest rates, rise in business confidence. Continuing along, for a decrease in aggregate demand: government, reduction in spending, increase in taxes, net exports, decrease in foreign demand, relative price increase in U.S. goods. For an increase in aggregate demand: government, increase in government spending, decrease in taxes, increase in foreign demand, this is for net exports, relative price drop of U.S. goods. The core of Keynesian analysis. Coordination argument. Downward wage and price flexibility requires perfect information about the level of lower compensation acceptable to other laborers and market participants. Expenditure multiplier. Keynesian concept that asserts that a change in autonomous spending causes a more than proportionate change in real GDP. Macroeconomic externality occurs when what happens at the macro level is different from and inferior to what happens at the micro level. An example would be where upward sloping supply curves for firms become a flat aggregate supply curve, illustrating that the price level cannot fall to stimulate aggregate demand. Menu costs. Costs firms face in changing prices. Sticky wages and prices. A situation where wages and prices do not fall in response to a decrease in demand, or do not rise in response to an increase in demand. The building blocks of Keynesian analysis. Keynesian economics focuses on explaining why recessions and depressions occur, and offers a policy prescription for minimizing their effects. The Keynesian view of recession is based on 2 key building blocks. First, aggregate demand is not always automatically high enough to provide firms with an incentive to hire workers to reach full employment. Second, the macroeconomy may adjust only slowly to shifts in aggregate demand because of sticky wages and prices, which are wages and prices that do not respond quickly to decreases or increases in demand. We'll consider these 2 claims in turn and see how they are represented in our ASAD model. Here's a Keynesian assumption using the model. The original equilibrium of this economy occurs where the aggregate demand function A intersects with AD intersects with AS. This is the intersection point at GDP called YP, potential. The economy is operating full employment. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, All the adjustments are happening, and we are seeing no change in price level, but all of the change is shown in a decrease in real GDP. The expenditure multiplier effect. Keynesians believe that any small change in economic activity cycles repeatedly through the economy and has a larger impact than the initial dollar amount spent. A change in aggregate expenditure circles through the economy. Households buy from firms, firms pay workers and suppliers, workers and suppliers buy goods from other firms, those firms pay their workers and suppliers, and so on. Continuing along, the expenditure or spending multiplier. The ratio of change in GDP to the change in aggregate expenditure, which caused the change in GDP. The multiplier has a value greater than 1. Marginal propensity to consume. Percentage of an increase or decrease in income, which one spends or reduces spending, also known as the MPC. Marginal propensity to import. Percentage of an increase or decrease in income, which one spends or reduces spending on imported goods or services. Marginal propensity to save. Percentage of an increase or decrease in income which one saves or reduces savings, also known as the MPS. How does the expenditure multiplier work? So if we take this example, the original increase in aggregate expenditure from government spending is 100. If people save 10% of their income, that means their MPC, their marginal propensity to consume, is 90% of income. So they will spend that 90%. So 100 minus the $10, the 10% of the 100 that they save, they spend $90. $90 of income to people through the economy, then they save another 10% of that. They spend 90% of it, so the third round is going to be 90 minus the $9 that they save. That was 10% of the 90. We get 81, and we can keep going through this. So Table 1 works through the process of the multiplier. Over the first 4 rounds of aggregate expenditures, the impact of the original increase of government spending of $100 creates a rise in aggregate expenditures of 100 plus 90 plus 81 plus $72.10, on and on. It's going to end up equaling an amount that is bigger than our initial change in government spending. That's the multiplier effect. Contractionary fiscal policy, efforts to decrease aggregate demand through tax increases or government spending cuts. Expansionary fiscal policy, efforts to increase aggregate demand through means such as tax cuts to stimulate consumption and investment, or or direct increases in government spending. GDP gap, the difference between actual and potential real GDP. During recessions, the gap grows. During booms, the gap becomes negative. The GDP gap. The GDP gap is defined as the difference between potential GDP and actual GDP, when both are measured in real terms. When the economy falls into recession, the GDP gap is positive, meaning the economy is operating at less than potential. When the economy experiences an inflationary boom, the GDP gap is negative, meaning the economy is operating at greater than potential. What is neoclassical economics? Keynesian economics, positive characteristic that the macroeconomy is inherently unstable, normative characteristic that since the private economy can't be counted on to keep the economy at potential GDP and full employment, government has a responsibility to step in to do so. Neoclassical economics, positive characteristic, the macroeconomy is inherently stable, i.e. that any divergences from potential GDP and full employment are temporary. Normative characteristic, government should take a laissez-faire or hands-off perspective and should not attempt to actively manage the macroeconomy. There are a number of schools of thought that can be included under the neoclassical perspective: traditional classical economics, monetarist economics, supply-side economics, sometimes called Reaganomics. Say's law and the neoclassical perspective. As the name neoclassical implies, the perspective of how the macroeconomy works is a new view of the old classical model of the economy. Say's law is a good explanation of the logic behind classical and neoclassical economics. Supply creates its own demand. Each time output is produced and sold, the revenues represent an equivalent amount of income generated. The neoclassical perspective and potential GDP. Human capital, education, training, and skills possessed by workers that make them more productive. Natural rate of unemployment, rate that unemployment returns to in the long run, where there is no cyclical unemployment. Neoclassical perspective, belief that the level of economic activity is determined primarily by aggregate supply. Physical capital proportion, the amount and kind of machinery equipment available to help a person produce a good or service. Potential GDP, level of output that can be achieved when all resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability are fully employed. The neoclassical perspective on macroeconomics is based on two building blocks or assumptions. One, since in the long run the economy will fluctuate around its potential GDP and its natural rate of unemployment, the size of the economy is determined by potential GDP. Two, wages and prices will adjust in a flexible manner so that disturbances such as recessions will be temporary and the economy will always return to its potential level of output on its own. Here we see the aggregate supply curve with neoclassical assumptions. In this model, potential GDP is shown with long-run aggregate supply as a vertical line. Neoclassical economists argue that the long-run aggregate supply curve is located at potential GDP. The vertical LRAS curve means that the level of aggregate supply or potential GDP will determine the real GDP of the economy. The role of flexible prices. How does the macroeconomy adjust back to its level of potential GDP in the long run? What if aggregate demand increases or decreases? The neoclassical view of how the macroeconomy adjusts is based on the insight that even if wages and prices are sticky or slow to change, in the short run, they're flexible over time. The speed of macroeconomic adjustment. Adaptive expectations, the theory that people look at past experience and gradually adapt their beliefs and behavior as circumstances change. Rational expectations, the theory that people form the most accurate possible expectations about the future that they can, using all information available to them. Continuing along, Keynesian economists argue that if adjustment from recession to potential GDP takes a very long time, then neoclassical theory may be more hypothetical than practical. John Maynard Keynes has said, in the long run, we are all dead. Because of rational expectations, prices do not wait on events, but adjust immediately. Policy prescriptions of the neoclassical perspective. The policy prescriptions are, because of flexible prices and wages, any divergence from potential output and full employment is self-correcting. Neoclassical economists do not believe in fine-tuning the economy. They believe that economic growth is fostered by a stable economic environment with a low inflation rate. Say's law versus Keynes' law. Keynes' law, demand creates its own supply. Say's law, supply creates its own demand. Neoclassical and Keynesian perspectives in the ADAS model. Intermediate zone, portion of the SRAS curve where GDP is below potential, but not so far below as in the Keynesian zone. The SRAS curve is upward sloping, but not vertical in the intermediate zone. Keynesian zone, the SRAS curve where GDP is far below potential and the SRAS curve is flat. Neoclassical zone, the portion of the SRAS curve where GDP is at or near potential output, where the SRAS curve is steep. Here we can see this in the zones. Keynesian is where it's flat. Intermediate is the neoclassical. 3 is the intermediate, and the neoclassical is up here where it's closer to the vertical. Balancing these two models. The short-term Keynesian model built on the importance of aggregate demand as a cause of business cycles and a degree of wage and price rigidity. Keynesian economics risks overlooking the long-term causes of economic growth or the natural rate of unemployment that exists even when the economy is producing a potential GDP. The neoclassical model, with its emphasis on aggregate supply, focuses on the underlying determinants of output and employment in markets. And that is all. I'll leave you to look over. There are 3 slides that have some of the questions that are a quick review, so you can look at these in the files where the PowerPoint slides are. Again, this is getting long, so rather than read through it, I'll let you look at it on your own.